Normally, it is an extremely rare case to sacrifice your queen and to win the game afterwards, but for today's video, I've picked 5 opening traps where it gets real. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and let's jump right into it. And for the first game, I couldn't pick anything else but the Blackmar Diemer Gambit, which starts off with the move pawn to d4, and after that, white sacrifices the pawn here on e4. After black accepts the sacrifice, you follow up with knight to c3, and it leads to extremely spectacular variation, potentially, where not only you can sacrifice your queen, but you can actually do it twice. That is something really interesting. Since you've attacked this pawn on e4, black will need to defend it, therefore they go knight to f6, and now you're going pawn to f3. It's a very classical gambit idea to sacrifice your pawn for the sake of quick development, and here you can do this in an opening starting from the queen pawn move pawn to d4. You've got a lot of similar lines in the openings arising from the first move pawn to e4, and so it's useful and interesting to have a similar choice for the situations where you're playing pawn d4. Alright, anyway, black captures here and you recapture with a queen. Not only bringing the queen out and potentially putting some pressure along these lines, but also potentially in the future you're preparing to castle queenside. Of course, you'll need to bring your bishop out somewhere, and after that you're prepared to castle queenside. At this point, black may think, well, it's all good, but what if I simply grab this pawn for nothing, because it looks like there is no danger whatsoever for black in taking this pawn. Then you play bishop e3, gaining one more tempo, attacking this queen, and also, even though black won this pawn, there is a subtle drawback that the d-file is now opened and your rook can possibly start operating right there very soon. Now, what should the black do? They can't really move their queen backwards, because then you'll really chase it with the rook, so they would have to move it somewhere else. Now let's say they go queen b4, which looks like a reasonable option, because it puts pressure onto this b2 pawn, therefore black not only removes the queen from danger, but also tries gaining in tempo, doing so. And then you castle, simultaneously protecting this pawn. Now your rook operates across the d-file, and you have somewhat advantage in activity here in development. You're ready potentially to develop some attack, but black may counterblow with the move bishop g4, which looks like is just an instant win for black after, capturing your rook on the next move. But that's the moment of truth where you say, hey, not everything that glitters is gold, because here I've got knight to b5. That's the first queen sacrifice, because if black dares to take it, then you follow up with knight takes c7, a very cool checkmate delivered by the knight in the center of the board. Notice that this rook is controlling an open file, and therefore the king cannot move there, so it is actually a checkmate. Alright, let's go back one move and see if there's anything else black can do here. Let's say your opponent notices the knight takes c7 threat and they decide, okay, let me go ahead and protect it with the knight. Knight goes to a6. But then there is another hidden idea behind moving your knight to b5. Not only it hits the pawn here on c7, but it also blocks the way of the black queen, enabling you to capture this pawn on b7, which actually does a lot of damage here. You're attacking here the rook, the knight, possibly queen to c6 check could be an idea, and knight takes c7 is still an eventual threat. Therefore, you have so much on your plate here. Most frequently, they respond rook to b8, which fails to another queen sacrifice. Whoa! Queen takes, knight takes, followed by knight takes c7. So it's kind of the similar checkmate, but delivered in even more beautiful way after the second queen sacrifice in a row. Now let's go back a few moves and see the final variation that black has here. Let's say they noticed all that, calculated all these lines, realized that knight a6 does not work, taking queen immediately, loses immediately. Let's say they think, okay, if the whole problem is the smothered checkmate here for the queen, let's give some space to the black king by playing pawn e5, right? So that the king can run away. And after knight takes c7, the king indeed can be moved to e7, it's not a checkmate, and while you capture that pawn, it looks like the position is still complex, because, well, black is also attacking something right here, and so black has some counter chances. But here, I'd like you to think about this position and write it down in the comments below, the winning move for white, in case you can find it. It's a pretty remarkable position, I gotta say. By the way, overall, this opening is a very interesting opening weapon. I've got a dedicated video where I go in details, showing some sidelines that I didn't cover here, so if you're interested, you may check this out. The next one is a must-know trap that happens in the Queen's Gambit decline here after black goes pawn to e6, one of the very common openings here after knight to f6, bishop g5. Black has a tricky move knight to d7, even though definitely some of your opponents will be aware of this trap, but many of them still won't because you're playing seemingly just normal developing moves and your opponent may not suspect that you're setting a trap here in fact. But you are indeed tempting them to take this pawn on d5, taking advantage of the pin. And it may seem like you just overlooked that the knight is pinned and white can go ahead and win this pawn on d5 for nothing. But in fact, you bait them to take this pawn because now, after knight takes d5, you're ready to temporarily sacrifice your queen because after bishop to b4, the crucial counter blow move, it turns out that there is no other way for white to cover their king but to give the queen back. And then you go ahead and take it happily, king takes d8, and at the end we can see that black has 3 minor pieces against 2. All in all, you're a piece up and it's time for white to resign. Also, I have a separate video where I cover 5 best opening traps arising from the white's first move pawn to d4, so if you're interested you may check this out later, and let's move on to the trap number 3. This is for white. Now after pawn e4, let's take a look at the Caro-Kann defense, pawn d4, pawn d5, knight c3, we're going over the main line, and one of the moves that black can play here is knight to f6. It's a pretty good opening choice for black. Magnus Carlsen loves playing this in Blitz, he does it many times. And now the main move is knight takes f6, but it leads to a bit dry positions where it's hard to push for a win. And there is a more interesting move, queen to d3. And it sets one little trap along the way, but it's okay because you're doing this along the way. If black wants to play bishop f5, hoping that they can pin the knight down to the queen, that does not really work because you take here an f6 with check. That's the critical drawback of the black move, and after that you just win this bishop. So that's the first thing how black can completely fail right away in the opening. But in this game we're analyzing, black noticed that, and they decided to play e5. They realized that white is having slightly shaky position here in the center, and they want to undermine it and take advantage of this. Because now after a pawn takes, the black has queen to a5 check. Pretty cool idea, because now after bishop d2, queen takes e5, putting the pin on the knight, which is also attacked by the black's knight from f6, and it may feel like white is already in trouble. Also, the queen is looking at this pawn on b2, and yeah, all in all, feels like white did something wrong. Anyway, white just stayed cool and castled, and here black thought, okay, I know what you're accounting for. If queen takes e4, then rook to e1, and because of this pin, I'm gonna lose my queen. Alright, I got it. And therefore, instead of that, they decided to take this knight with their knight, thinking, okay, now just win a piece for nothing, right? But not so quickly, because queen comes down here to d8. And all of a sudden, that's a beautiful queen sacrifice. Well, no surprise for us, we know that this whole video is about queen sacrifices, right? But that definitely came as a shocker to the black player here, because after king takes, there is a discovered check and a double check, delivered by bishop and rook here from d1, therefore the king has to move, and either way, it doesn't end well for black. If king goes to c7, leads to bishop d8, a very beautiful and extremely rare checkmating construction here. I've never seen anything like that in other variations. Let's go and move back. And if black decides to go the other way, king e8, king to e8, then it leads to rook d8. So still checkmate, delivered this time on d8 by the rook. Pretty cool and practical opening trap. In this example, after e4, black played e5, the most common move, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Ruy Lopez, the most classical chess opening of all, knight f6, very popular nowadays, Benoni Defense, white castles, black takes here the pawn on e4 and then d4. Since white sacrificed the pawn, they want to open up the position here in the center and create some damage, maybe putting the pin along the e-file, which actually happened. After black took this pawn, white played rook to e1, and since the knight is attacked here by the rook, black needs to cover it, so they play pawn to d5, and now queen takes d4. And all of a sudden, black realized that, well, their life is not that easy now, because what can they do? Normally, they'd wish to develop this bishop and castle, but if they do so now, then queen takes g7 is a problem. Queen can go ahead and take this pawn, right? Regardless of where the bishop moves. By the way, the knight is pinned, so black cannot play something like this. For example, you can just take it, right? The knight is pinned, so it can never move. And if not developing the bishop from here, from f8, then it's hard to come up with anything. And primarily because both of the black's knights are actually pinned, right, to the king. in different ways. So black decided, okay, let's take it one by one. Let's first neutralize this pawn. And he played pawn to a6. White traded here and played knight to g5. Now white's aiming to trade here the knight and to go after the black king. Black started to get worried about this, which is correct, and they decide, okay, let me play queen to f6, offering the queen exchange, because in an endgame, at least black will not be checkmated, and there is still a pawn up, by the way. The queen here attacks this queen, potentially the pawn on f2, therefore it's not easy for white to escape from this queen trade, but white found an interesting way. They took here with a knight, offering the queen sacrifice, followed by knight to f6 check. A very, very sneaky and unexpected checkmate delivered this way with rook to e8. Truly spectacular, came as a shocker for black for sure, very beautiful combination in a common line of the Ruy Lopez. And the final trap for today starts with a queen pawn move, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, and here if black responds with pawn to c5, attacking this pawn, white may decide to protect it with the knight, and then after an exchange of pawns you play pawn to e5. You're choosing the most aggressive approach here. Now the knight is attacked, and going backward is a bit, passive, so white may wish to go forward. Knight goes to b5, trying to take advantage of this weak square potentially, so black goes pawn d5. Now white takes it happily, thinking that black overlooked something, because if you take here on d5, let's say with a queen, it fails to knight c7 with a triple fork to the king, queen, and rook. That's certainly something white would be completely happy about, and therefore you don't play that. You play a bishop to c5, which looks like a move played out of desperation, that you just calculated that taking this pawn immediately does not work, and you decide, okay, I'm a pawn down, let's just keep playing on. And white thinks, okay, let me now play this pawn d6. Not only this pawn is now protected by the knight, so that you can't capture anymore, but it also prepares knight to c7 fork. Very unpleasant. But you go knight e4, a counterblow, which prepares knight takes d6, potentially just taking the pawn back, but also prepares bishop takes f2. And in this game, white decided, okay, let me just play the knight c7 intermediate move, which is a check, and once the king is forced to move and the rook can now run away from the corner, I will then handle this problem with the f2 pawn. But instead of moving the king, black just sacrificed the queen here, which led to a very smooth checkmate, bishop takes f2. Pretty cool line as well, and very, very practical trap, because again, the previous moves of white seemed so advantageous and tempting to play for white. And if you enjoy these traps, then consider subscribing to the channel, because I'm actually preparing a lot of good stuff coming your way, such as continuation of the b3 opening, which many of you guys have asked about, also some best opening traps of 2021, and many other good stuff coming your way. Therefore, consider subscribing and hitting that bell for not missing out on future videos. Of course, keep winning, keep pushing, talk soon.